Without further ado, here is Melissa.
Thanks so much. Let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully people can see that. I'm gonna take that as a yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I just realized that the header here was not changed from, I had used these slides in a previous talk, but I'm going to be talking about the same thing, about augmenting human creativity with automated text generation. So I'm coming at this topic from a AI research perspective. Largely academic research is my background. So positioning it in that context, I just want to give an overview of where the topic of augmenting human creativity with NLP with text generation fits. So obviously, as all of you know, computers that model human behavior, that's generally associated with the term artificial intelligence or AI. Machine learning is also used too. That's a particular technique in artificial intelligence. Computers that model human creativity, this endeavor is typically associated with the term computational creativity. And then computers that model human language, this is associated with the term natural language processing or NLP. So the focus of my work has been at the intersection between these two things within the umbrella of AI. So this is often referred to as creative language generation. That's the general research area in which most of my work has been focused. So AI models have been used to generate various forms of creative language. So things like poetry, song lyrics, slogans, word blends, jokes and puns, short stories. Obviously, there's no limit to the types of creative language that AI can be used to generate because there's no limit to the types of creative language people can produce. So I want to talk about one type of creative language generation task that I've worked on specifically for the purpose of trying to help augment human creativity in writing. And the way this can be thought of broadly, as far as how it's connected to creative writing in general, is idea elaboration. I'm going to be calling it here, and in my work, I call it text infilling as a specific instance of idea elaboration. So broadly, idea elaboration means taking some seed, some representation of an idea and expanding it into something larger with more detail. Text infilling, what I looked at, involved using a prompt, so a list of words, for example, and then transforming that sequence of words into a complete sentence or segment of text. In other words, infilling words within those prompt words in order to complete the sentence. So this is an example here of if you have a prompt shoulders, waves, color, you can then produce a model that will do this text infilling task by placing words in between the prompt words. So let me back up for a second and just talk broadly about the question of why are computers useful for augmenting human creativity? So why do we even want to use AI to do this? There's a really important cognitive scientist named Margaret Bowden who wrote a foundational book on computational creativity. And part of what she focused on was the idea that human creativity involves unfamiliar combinations of familiar ideas. And so this is often a process of serendipity, the process of coming up with a new idea. In other words, chance with judgment. So when you're brainstorming, for example, you make a lot of different connections between disparate ideas. some of them are not necessarily meaningful, but some you might encounter actually have some value. And so the role that computers can possibly play in this process from this perspective is this simulation of combinations. So computers can help produce a bunch of different connections between ideas that we as humans might not have otherwise considered. A lot of them might not be necessarily be meaningful, but some that we encounter actually might be something that we can attribute meaning to. And that's the role that AI can possibly play in the process of augmenting human creativity. So that's what a lot of my research has focused on, has been motivated by this idea, trying to investigate, is there something to this general theory for how computers can help people with creative writing tasks? So just to talk broadly about the types of models that are often used for creative text generation. I know a lot of you are familiar with these models already. Machine learning is the most conventional approach now to doing text generation, and then specifically for creative text generation. And this is just a broad scheme of what machine learning, how it's actually applied to text generation. So you have some sort of input, an encoding of the input, and an output. Everything is represented numerically. So you have these large vectors of numbers. So vector just meaning a list that has some numerical representation of your input, which could be, for example, the prompt for the infilling task. Then your model encodes that into what can be considered the meaning of the prompt, and then it outputs some, what ultimately is a probability distribution over, in this case, if the task is text infilling, over different words that could be infilled between those prompt words. So the point with this is just to emphasize that machine learning involves representing all of text numerically. And the fact that it gives a probability distribution is particularly helpful for computational creativity, because it means that it, so to speak, entertains all the different possibilities of what could appear in a given segment, and allocates high amounts of probability to things that are likely to occur, but it still allocates some small amount of probability to things that are unlikely. So let me be a little more specific about that. So I mentioned text infilling can be, this particular model can be applied to that task. So you have some sort of representation of your prompt that's all just a vector of numbers, and that gets used to output the infilled text. So the way that the model learns to do this is just by reading a bunch of prompt text pairs to obtain probabilities for what words appear in the infilled text. And so then the texts are generated from prompts according to these probabilities. You might have heard of GPT-2. I think maybe it's going to be discussed today. The particular model that I worked with for text infilling made use of GPT-2. Its advantage is just that it has a lot of parameters, so a lot of numbers in this encoding layer, and it's seen millions of documents. So it has some knowledge, quite a bit of knowledge of the English language, and it can be tuned for an individual task, in this case, the text infilling task that transforms prompts into full, complete sentences. So again, to emphasize how the probabilistic nature of these models is particularly useful for aiding creativity, I mentioned there's always some probability distribution that's output in the final layer of this model. And so that means that there's a combinatorial process when generating from using one of these models where you're iteratively sampling from different probabilities. And because of this iterative process, it means that there's always some small amount of probability that it gets allocated to things that might not have been directly observed in a text that the model has learned from before. And you're combining many, many different possibilities such that what you end up with ends up very often being something that's completely novel. So this relates back to this how how computers are good at simulating combinations. This is a definitely an instance that represents that ability to simulate combinations, and machine learning definitely lends itself very much to that. Okay, so let me just briefly describe some of the experiments that I did with text infilling to investigate how AI is useful for helping human writers. So I showed you an example of the text infilling task. One of the questions that I pursued in my research was, does observing automatically generated examples of an authoring task, so in this case I was focusing on text infilling, help people better perform the task themselves? So looking at having people do the text infilling task themselves, is there any impact when they observe examples of AI performing this? So to investigate this, the design was having people write sentences without seeing any generated examples of text infilling, and then having people observe generated examples and then write new sentences, new infilled sentences after observing those examples. And then given these pairs, show them to other people to judge which ones they like better, or just make a comparison between the infilled sentences that were written before observing the generated examples and those written after. So here's an example very briefly of the interface that an author was shown for this task. So they're shown this list of words. They are then shown the automatically generated examples of infilled sentences that contain these prompt words. And then they're asked to write 2 different sentences that contain the prompt words as well. In the case where, so remember there's 2 stages, the pre and post. Pre, they did not see any of these generated examples that are shown here. So this shows the post stage where the generated examples were shown in order to try to evaluate the impact of those examples. So without going into any of the exact details of all these experiments, the final takeaway was that authors did indeed write more appealing sentences after they observed the generated examples. So the generated examples did have some impact on the authoring task. And just to give you kind of a qualitative idea about what might have been going on that could influence this process, it's possible that the generated examples activated concepts connecting to prompt words that authors did not previously consider. So this goes back to Margaret Bowden's idea of how computers can simulate unexpected combinations of familiar ideas, and that ends up being a valuable contribution to human creativity. So for example, this is a real instance from the resulting data. The prompt was shoulders, waves, and color. In the pre-stage, when this particular author saw this prompt, they wrote something that didn't reference the concept of hair. So the generated example here that they ended up seeing in the post stage mentioned this term hair. And then they wrote something that also made use of this semantic concept of hair to connect the prompt words. So just qualitatively looking at the difference in the sentence that they wrote before and after seeing the generated example, we can theorize that the generated example gave this particular author a new idea for how these prompt words could be connected. And in this case, it happened to be through the concept of hair. So that just gives you an idea of how the AI system could be helping people by possibly activating concepts that they didn't previously consider or wouldn't consider outside of the context of the interaction with the AI. So just to wrap up what the challenges are for work moving forward, success in this context means, in contrast to other AI tasks where the focus is on autonomous performance, success here means the AI system helps the author. That's the goal. But we don't really know ahead of time what is necessarily going to be helpful to people. That hasn't really been mapped out in this space yet. So what we need are design and evaluation paradigms that focus on authors' objectives. So this was one motivation for my experiments with infilling, to try to isolate or figure out what the impact of the generated examples on people's writing process was. And so we're just kind of starting off with this type of research to really figure out in an efficient way, what do people actually find helpful about these systems. So we have these kind of like presumptions about what's helpful, but we haven't really started to rigorously test them in a way that's totally driven by the objectives of the author. So this is a challenge that that will need to be addressed in order to further develop these types of systems. All right, so that's it for the slides that I had. And obviously I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure if we'll wait for that, or I guess just let me know.
Yeah, let's wait for the questions at the end, and
Okay.
we can have Stanley go on next.
Sounds good. So I'll stop sharing. There we go.
All right, Stanley.
Hey guys. My gosh. Melissa, that was such an incredible talk. The slides were so clear. I've been doing different types of natural language stuff for like 10 years or something, but that got me really fired up about GPT and transformer models. I really feel too like the kind of thinking that you really covered in such a complete and concise way about how these things would actually be used as tools by writers are so interesting. One that really kind of jumped out at me and I was thinking about was the sort of completion map where potentially like the human's job could be to just list the nouns or the nouns and the verb, and then let some good language come out of that. In my own work as a developer, it's so interesting. People are actually applying the same transformer-based language models to code as a language, and so GitHub has a product called Copilot that I use, and different people are getting good usage out of that actually will complete your code. And so in a pretty functional environment, people are experimenting with like, what are these types of AIs good for? What can they learn? What are they less good at learning? In my experience, if there's any coders or data scientists in the audience, like working with like complex multi-index objects is actually something these AIs are kind of good at figuring out. They obviously make mistakes, but I save myself a lot of time by like just kind of doing the rough elements of a multi-index, and then sort of in the same completion way that we saw in those slides. It sort of fills out the the object creation. GPT-2 is such a great system. Would myself feel remiss without talking for at least a moment about the stochastic parrots situation, where Google's head of ethics raised what I think was a very good set of concerns about these language models, because the thing about them is the complexity of what they can learn from language, and also the scope of the language that passes under their nose they're potentially learning from. There's enormous risk for biases that are present in language to be, without our knowledge, transferred to these AIs. And yeah, concern about and understanding of like what they learn, how they learn, I think is yeah, something that has to be remarked on before I like let myself nerd out a little bit. But anyway, now that I've made that note, I wanted to start by talking about a book that a friend of mine wrote, a fellow researcher who is in this case writing under the pen name K. Alado McDowell. In the AI community, you might know him as Kenrick, and I believe he's at Google and does work with their AI strategy. He also is an author, or at least in the case of this book, he's a co-author. He's a co-author with yeah, GPT-3. I love this book. On Twitter, I am at science_Stanley. If you DM me on Twitter, I will buy you a copy of this book. It's a good read. It's fun. It's a sort of conversation about consciousness and AI that's being carried out between a human and an AI. And it happens in a very interesting way. Paragraph by paragraph are traded off. And you really like, if you're a reader who sort of gets used to the sense of a person's voice, it really does feel like there's two voices in the writing. Although obviously, since one paragraph is a prompt for GPT's, regurgitation, it has an interesting flavor in terms of like what's being responded to, what's being said. Yeah, great read, and obviously great conversation piece. And yeah, just a little bit of a sort of background about my involvement with these tools, and maybe also a bit of explanation and an apology for my my slide quality being much more ad hoc. I had worked in like language transformers for a number of years, but at the start of the pandemic, actually switched into using them for language models of genomes for viruses and bacteria. So it's yeah, definitely been a crazy couple of weeks, and yeah, I don't have much opportunity in my day job recently to use AI for creative projects, but I contribute to like a community makerspace in Venice that tries to pair technologists with artists. We've done some of our coolest stuff in partnership with AI LA. We partner additionally with this very old school art patronage network in Venice called the Augment Studios, and so it kind of creates an opportunity for artists to come to the table and work on projects together with technologists. Obviously, like in the current climate, we're seeing what activation can come from the merging of those communities in a Web3 context. But anyway, my sort of personal practice there has been taking some of these new AI tools, so language transformers, and these transformer intelligences, or I don't know if people have seen, also being released in a multimodal architecture. So things where, in addition to giving a text seed and getting out a text target, you can put in a text seed and get an image target, or vice versa. So yeah, some of these tools are things that I've been working with artists recently. And yeah, like I said, my slides are very ad hoc. So for my first, or I guess my first visual, I actually grabbed this cool image from Melissa's talk. It was yeah, one of her early slides had this big swirl of numbers, and I was like, oh, this will be a cool example of some of the ways that I'm using these tools. So okay, so I grabbed this here, and I'm just going to go over to a Google Colab notebook that I have set up to run. And so I'm feeding in this cool swirly image here. And it's a multimodal GAN that's kind of a conjoining of a transformer model of language and a an image model. So the image it's being fed is that weird number swirl that I grabbed from Melissa's talk. And then the seed text is a wave of cyberpunk numbers. So it's a GAN, so it's an adversarial conversation between two neural networks. And so as it's updating, it's actually cycling back and forth between the networks, which are essentially minimizing the loss in comparison with the images that it measures as like close in the training corpus to cyberpunk wave of numbers, whatever that ends up looking at. Like you see though, it very much does get some cyberpunk style elements and even some fairly complex ones. Obviously the color composition very cyberpunky. The font of the numbers like has changed too as it's been running, and it's even separately adding more cyberpunk motifs in the back. Like we have a cityscape and a weird figure out of just about nowhere. Yeah, these tools are so exciting. Without hopefully venturing onto ice that's too thin, I think that there's aspects of these like GAN-based architectures that are reminiscent of the way information flows through like the pyramidal neurons of the brain, which are sort of in the neocortex, I've been told by scientists from that area. So I myself have thought that these tools are kind of like, the image tools, the language tools, all of them. It's a reverse engineering of the human imagination, and it's a very exciting thing to be a part of. Anyway, last step in my little spiel here, and thank you guys for letting me take some much less structured time to talk about what's really exciting for me in these fields. Inspired by Pharmaco AI and this tool that allows this sort of conversational iteration between image and text, like through an AI. A really brilliant artist and technician named Nick, who I have the good fortune of working with, has been kind of taking the Pharmaco AI concept of like, so what I've been calling this is cybernetic, co-creation. And normally we think of cybernetic as like, oh, there's a robot thing attached or whatever. But for me, I've built systems that optimize like labor distribution for networks of workers. And you might call that cybernetic. You might call it Uber a cybernetic driver network or something like that. It's a hybridized amalgam of inputs to a control system that are both human and machine. So in the sense that Pharmaco AI would be like a cybernetic co-creation of a novel, this wonderful gentleman, Nick, has been doing these cybernetic co-creations of scenery and landscape. And so essentially feeding a seed image to an AI with a description, getting back the output, and then drawing on it. So that's like the conversation back to the AI, and then feeding it back into this seed image and seeing what comes out. So anyway, I just am going to show a couple of the outputs of this really cool project that my good friend Nick has done. And also, I think Nick, the first one's so good. And and as these things get better and better, I really think that this might be how you make a 3D movie set in the future. You might ask a movie or one of these AIs that's trained on 3D data to say, like, imagine a room with a grandfather clock and a blah, 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 blah. Then you go into it, change some things, regenerate it. I'm serious. I think that will work for some pretty realistic holodeck level stuff. And that's what's going on in these. So in these images, it's being asked to maybe generate a cyberpunk landscape, and then it's being drawn on, change this here, change this there, to kind of get the buildings the way you want to say. Here's the third one that I have ready. And so you can see here, in addition to the buildings, we're getting some background elements and the ocean. And yeah, so I think also that's about my allotted time. But in addition, for the Q&A, I think Nick is in the audience and might be willing to talk about his work, and outside of just like the technical part too, because I think I only did a very mild slice of Melissa's level of presentation. Maybe it could be cool to hear Nick talk about the experience as a creative of like coming to these AI tools, because I do think that outside of developing them with it, which is a huge piece of work, like educating and sharing them, really inclusively is going to be super important. Anyway, you guys, thanks so much for letting me talk to you about one of my favorite subjects. It was really fun. And yeah, I hope you guys are having a good evening.
Hey, Stanley. Hey, everyone. This is Nick. Just wanted to say thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Stanley. Melissa, I was playing with GPT-2 earlier, and the way that you described how it augments creativity, it really just kind of helped the idea cement in my brain, because of course, with any type of technology, you need to learn how to use it. And coming up with prompts is just as much of a skill as strumming strings on a guitar. I'm a musician. I've been a musician my whole life, and I've been, bound by the laws of physics as a musician, or at least in my early years. Once I discovered digital instruments, I went full force into that because I understood how code translates into dollars. And, when the record industry crashed in 1999, we didn't have a way to turn our art into dollar signs. So turning code into instruments that could then be sold as tools for creatives has been kind of, as Stanley says, the corpus, the seed of, and I might be misusing that word, but kind of like the seed of how I think about my creativity. And this particular art, GAN in general, or using text to generate ideas, is incredibly liberating. Stanley showed me an avocado armchair, a prompt that quite literally changed the way that I thought about creativity in general, and showed me Pixray, which is a text-to-image generation generative adversarial neural network. And I applied my musicianship to that, right? I thought about this as an instrument. And what do you do with an instrument? Well, A, you play with it, and B, you practice it, right? And I realized midway into that, I was like, wow, okay, so practice is really the most important thing that I learned as being a musician, because if you can't sell the product of making a song, then, well, what do you get out of it? Well, it's the ability to practice something. So I've went full force and just trying to put these AI tools through their paces, and really put them to work and see what they can do. And the only way to do that is by one iteration after the other, or one output after the other. So whereas in the physical world, it's like 10,000 hours is what it takes to master something. Well, in the AI world, it might be 10,000 iterations, and that might not take you 10,000 hours, that might take you a lot sooner in that. And really what it is about practicing these tools. And once I generated some of this AI work, I started with the corpus of love, right, as being the thing that I wanted my images to start with. I noticed how that changes the way the image came out. So I would create a bunch of images starting with that, and then realizing how the combination of words kind of changes from image to image. Started to get enough images to where I was like, oh, well, I want more than this. This is more than just text to image. How do I create a narrative? And just being in the spirit of this type of machine learning, I was like, oh, why don't I try GPT-2 to actually create the narrative of whatever this story is. I have some video editing skills, right? So it's like, okay, well, let's have a cityscape that zooms into a specific house, that zooms into a specific room within the house, and then starts a dialogue between two generated portraits or something like that. Or where do I get the words from? And that's where GPT-2 comes in. And I was just playing with this earlier, and I'll end it with this. It's like, what perfect timing to kind of go through the different outputs and kind of see what's possible with this technology. and then to attend my first AILA on a subject that I was playing with earlier at the perfect time. It's just serendipitous, and I just really wanted this to share my thanks, A, for the time that you guys have given me to kind of speak my mind, and B, just to be an artist alive at this specific time when we have this ability to not only be a physical artist, but to explore the digital arts in a way that is different than any other generation has allowed us to. I think that this is powerful. I think that it's special, and I don't think it's limited to the technical minded. I think that is absolutely a practice, and something that every creative should be able to apply their creativity to, and as Melissa, you were saying, augment their creativity in a meaningful way. So that's my 2 cents on this. It's very exciting. Thanks for your time. And thank you for this opportunity to learn with you guys.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really, pertaining to what you're saying, I'm really grateful to this community of, in my case, writers who are excited about these AI-based tools and have taken a lot of time to explore the possibilities. And there's a paper I read recently on defining this whole exercise of people trying to take advantage of these tools. In the case of GPT-2 and GPT-3, this endeavor is called prompt programming. So trying to figure out if I want this system to generate this particular type of text, or a text that fulfills a certain type of purpose, what is the input that I need to give it to do that? And there's people who have just spent tons and tons of time trying to figure this out. And it really is more, at this point, that's more art than science. And I'm coming at it from a scientific perspective, where I actually want to understand that process of how people are doing this, and how then we can push it even further so that these tools are able to deliver more of what people are looking for when they interact with these things.
Well, I agree. Like, how awesome is it that like people like me get to collaborate with
Exactly.
yourself? And not only that, like it's beyond that. It's like we get to collaborate with this machine, quite literally. And you were saying with Margaret Roden, I believe, computers think of things that we don't. I mean, that's kind of the essence of being in a band, right? Like I've been in a lot of bands where the drummer could also sing. And could also play the guitar and could also do this, but they sat into their role and they collaborated and were able to create something that could only be created by that specific group of people. So now you kind of have this band of intelligence that you're working with in order to be creative. It's beautiful.
One thing I love in the kind of area of like the benefits of teamwork and like group and intelligence from groups, not like single focused intelligence, is underlying a lot of that visual creation technology that we showed off in Nick's work is GANs, and they're generative adversarial networks. It's kind of funny. The first time I ever used them, the founder I was working for gave me the feedback, why does it got to be adversarial? And at the time, I thought that was kind of silly, and maybe it was silly actually. But it's true that it's not necessarily adversarial. Like sometimes when you talk about a GAN, like these ones that are drawing things, creating things, they call them like a teacher and a student neural network, right? So you could think of it as adversarial because one of them's like grading the other one, and then we all maybe have that experience of trauma. But for the AIs, as much as anything, it's a collaborative process between their learning. And it's so cool because the thing that rocketed these technologies over the uncanny valley is 100% the transition to teamwork, and sort of giving up on training a single neural network to handle everything, but having two that sort of co-learn. I feel like it's hopefully maybe some mathematical evidence we're on the right idea with this decentralization stuff too.
Amazing. Yeah, if anyone has more questions, please put them in the chat. But to get into this little conversation, continue the conversation really. Melissa, you're talking about success for these AI machines are focusing on helping the writer, right? Not necessarily around automation. How, I guess, when it comes to maybe writing books and writing books to screenplays, or more actually writing literature or even news, writing media, do you think there's going to be more like warnings or like some types of like labelings saying that this was co-authored with an AI machine, or how do you think that's going to unravel over time so that it's not just giving complete ownership to that human that was using the tool, but actually letting people know that there was some type of augmentation?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question that gets into certainly the ethics of these tools as well, as far as things like plagiarism, because all of these models are actually looking at human text that's been out there, and yet they're not currently, they're not actually giving any attributions for where they learned the things that they've learned. So yeah, I think that it'll be really interesting to see where we right now, like we do have some writing tools, so things like, simple spell check and grammar check are things that are already integrated into almost every word processing interface that we use. Companies like Grammarly have slightly more advanced writing assistance tools that will suggest some things that can influence the content of your writing, like paraphrasing and suggesting, different ways of saying something or changing the tone of the writing. And it seems like we're kind of comfortable with these tools such that we don't feel like it's cheating to be using them, or that we have to make any sort of give this sort of disclaimer that this, I use this tool to help me do this. But yeah, you start to, there is a point at which, well, if the system is making enough of a contribution such that certain words perhaps are taken directly from the output of a given model, does that mean that we do need to have that disclaimer? And I don't exactly know where where is the line there, where we have to then give credit to these tools. I still kind of feel like these experiences and these interfaces can place the human author at the center such that they have the upper hand in how everything gets used, and it's really just a tool. And so, we can talk about it as, AI as co-collaborators, but really I see these things as tools, and the goal is just, for the person to be able to use the tool in whatever way helps them achieve their writing objective. So yeah, I do think I don't have an answer to at what point do you have to give credit to an AI system. But I also think it's interesting that the way we think about technology in general, we haven't, even with some of the existing technologies, that we haven't really ever, we don't have a precedent for that right now. So yeah.
To keep on that topic, I was thinking, what about like different schools of thought? Like, will there be opportunities for these types of AI tools to be heavily branded so that people know that, this type of writing, you go to this specific type of AI service? I'm thinking like more like if you're an actor, you have different coaching, right? And people know, okay, you went to Juilliard or whatnot. I was thinking like, how will that, evolve over time when we're using technology as tools, as ways of schools of thought of how to approach creativity with this augmentation.
Right. So there's a lot of opportunity for customization with these tools where, for example, you have different models for different people and different models for different genres, or et cetera. You can tailor them to an individual person or whatever type of writing task that you're pursuing, and even genres within that. So it is interesting to think about the notion of branding these tools such that if it's modeled after a specific writer, like does that that does seem to make a difference in the technology, and how do people, how are they supposed to perceive that tool itself in connection with a specific author? Yeah.
Todd, I really like your haircut, by the way. Sorry, you just popped up on the screen for the first time, so I wanted to let you know. Something interesting, just kind of like growing out of that question, though. Also, one thing about GPT-2 and 3 is it's learned from so much language, but you can learn to it a particular nugget of language to get it to sound in like a particular way. So it's very interesting to think in the future you might like, oh, I need some dialogue that sounds like it was written by Stephen King. And there might be like a digital agency where you can rent out access to an API that has those generative properties. And not just for text too, for other visual styles and images. One particularly cool example is like I saw a Hollywood company. They had, I'm brain farting on the name, but it's the motion capture rig they used for the Mandalorian. It has like 400 cameras, but high resolution at all areas, and kind of does a photogrammetry capture thing. The technician, they were showing me that like, if they have a person kind of walk around naturally and sort of stand and sit down on a chair, a number of kind of stock motions, they can do generative animation for any kind of posture or movement. So, I kind of joked in my with some friends the other day that they'll call the hub for those kind of models like decentral casting.
I love that. There's a question in the decentral casting. Stephen Quax had a question. How can AI tools be used to help large groups engage in collective creativity? What have you seen out there in the wild?
Well, actually, some of my work was inspired by existing collaborative writing tools where instead of, an automated system providing, for example, one task I worked with was story continuation, where you're providing the next sentence in the story, and that was the role of the AI system. There's actually already systems that do this with human actors, getting, trying to elicit a suggestion for the next sentence in a story, and then getting that from another human author. So in that way, you are collaborating in creating the story. So it's, these things these are actually good models for how possibly automated assistants could work. And of course, we have to take into account the fact that AI and human writing are different, and they could complement each other in that way. But yeah, it is also a good source of inspiration to figure out what should the design and then also evaluation practices be for these systems. Can we look to the existing tools for collaborative writing to try to gain inspiration for that?
I'll just say real quick, this is Nick. Volume, like the amount of volume you can get from 100 people trying to write a paragraph with this technology versus, just you yourself trying to put that prompt through the AI 100 times is, exponential. At that point, you can just get so many more ideas, right? Like if I put a prompt through, I got like 12 tabs open right now, running interior design prompts, right? Like that's just me. So if everyone here is running those 12, then essentially you could have 240 within the same amount of time, right? So it's just pure volume, the amount of volume that you can get, and each of those is its own individual idea.
That's it's very interesting, and another aspect of it too is like in terms of the volume, like the volume of data that these things process. Like on like a commercial project, you have a team to handle the data generation. which is like a bug, but it can be a feature that multiple humans can contribute to the data sets that train an art AI. I shared in the chat a cool project. It's a Web3 NFT project where people are democratically voting on the data sets that will be fed to a generative art AI. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's like, you know, it kind of makes me go back to that thing that people are, that I've seen people say that as a transformative technology, AI should probably be likened to electricity, because when electricity was invented, it wasn't just one thing that was changed. It was almost every physical action that was made easy and like industrially scalable. And this really takes like almost every step of intelligence in any process and potentially accelerates it, or, you know, diversifies or expands the inclusivity. I have to say too, like, Melissa, your research and your tools as a person who's struggled with dyslexia really have some appeal too. I mean, I don't know if that's, I'm actually curious if that's something that there's been an application to, but other sort of language pathologies, I think there's a lot of people that these things will give voices to. Do you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's a whole research area that's focused on this type of writing assistance that maybe focuses on like a clinical use case. My particular work hasn't really made any sort of assumptions about necessarily the population of people who are using these tools, other than making a general assumption that the people that I've included in experiments as authors don't have any sort of background they're not professional writers, because the whole idea is that I'm trying to kind of make this work on broad technologies that might help people who are not already wouldn't already consider themselves good at creative writing. But yeah, there's all sorts of ways to tailor these things to specific populations, and I have seen some work specifically on that type of adaptation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always about sensitivity to like what the goals are. So I am always careful, for example, when I talk to people who are professional writers about these things, to ensure that, to make it clear, I'm not making any particular assumptions about how they should be using these tools. So it's not like I'm going to write a story for you and you're going to use it. Obviously, people get very upset by that sort of thing, and that makes sense. So I think it's always important to have to avoid making too many presumptions about how AI or computers in general, computational creativity, will be useful to people. And especially when you're exploring, you know, use cases for specific types of perhaps language impairment, you want to definitely have an open mind for figuring out and actually talk to the people who are, you know, affected in these populations to figure out informed hypotheses for how these things can be useful. It's easy to just kind of make assumptions, but yeah.
I think going to be a whole field, like across a broad range of societal activities, like trying to find out the right ways to work in, you know, positively with people's actual needs. Have you ever, Melissa, have you ever read anything by Murakami, the author?
I don't think so.
Incredible author. 1Q84 is a stupendous book. Interesting. I believe that the gentleman writes his work in Japanese and then translates it to English and back to Japanese as part of his like internal process, which just goes to, like, you know, suggest how diversely these tools might be used, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually played around with doing that task myself, and it is very fun to see what gets changed in the process of the translation. And There is a writer who worked with, her name's Sigal Samuel. If you've read anything by her, I haven't, but she worked with GPT-2. And one of the things that she emphasized was that the tool helped her, what she called see things anew. And that's kind of what that particular task of doing the back translation, when I looked at the output, it was like, oh, you're kind of suddenly becoming aware of all the assumptions that go into what your input was or your text that you provided to the system was, and seeing things in kind of fresh eyes. So that's what that reminded me of.
Isn't that great with education as well? I mean, on the subject of taking a paragraph and having her write the next paragraph, my daughter, she's 12, 12 and a half. Yeah, 12 and a half, I should say, when you're that old, you go by half years. Her favorite book is Warriors, which is, it's like a cat themed book. And the author is Aaron Hunter. And that's a pseudonym. It's actually like a team of writers, but one of the writers is putting out a contest right now where it's like you write the paragraph and then there's different age groups that write the second paragraph for that. And each of those paragraphs will then lead to, some sort of winning. And I immediately thought of this GPT-2. I was like, oh yeah, well, what if we had the third paragraph and we wrote it as GPT-2 or GPT-3? So I think as a learning tool, when you're kind of going through the process of learning whatever it is, an instrument, how to write, how to draw, whatever it is, that these technologies will allow you to kind of see the unseen and think of ideas that are new and more complex than you would have thought of. And if you explore them at a younger age, it's like, okay, well, what is that going to do for creativity as a whole? Kind of having that augmented layer on top of your creativity and being able to see it from this expert's view that you control in some sort of way, if that makes sense. I think is really cool.
I'm hoping to just be more passive though. I'm just hoping infinite Netflix forever, and I'm just gonna put my feet up. I'm kidding, of course, but Todd, just noticing the time. Do you need us to stop our flapping at some point, or?
I mean, we can keep on going if you like, but yeah, normally this is around the time when we close down and we start asking people in the audience of like what topic we should be discussing next. But first, thank you so much, Stanley and Melissa, for your time and your expertise. It's a fun topic we could really dive into for a lot longer if we needed to. But yeah, trying to always keep this thing up to 1 hour for our audience. But this is actually going to be our last special interest group for this year. In December is because it's the last Monday of the month. We felt like we should just take a break and allow everyone to kind of enjoy the end of the year, and then we would reconvene in January.